A cop beats up a black homeless man and takes away his last money. However, fate does not forgive such actions, and karma catches up with him after only a minute. Find out how this case turned the lives of everyone involved upside down. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments, where are you watching this video from? The rain began as a light drizzle, but soon turned into a steady downpour, soaking everything in sight. In the dim light of the street lamps, water pooled along the cracked pavement of the city's outskirts. The night air carried a sharp chill, and the rhythmic sound of raindrops hitting the tin roofs and trash can lids echoed through the empty streets. Sitting on the cold, damp steps of an abandoned building, Jerome pulled his tattered coat tighter around his shoulders. It offered little protection against the elements, but it was all he had. He watched the rain with tired eyes, his mind wandering to places far from this desolate corner of the world. His thoughts were a refuge from the biting cold and the ache in his stomach, but even they offered no solace tonight. Memories, vivid and piercing, flooded back unbidden. He had once been someone. Not a shadow skulking in alleyways, not the invisible figure passers-by avoided making eye contact with. He had been a teacher, a mentor, someone who made a difference. His life had been full of purpose, full of people who depended on him and valued his contributions. The flashbacks came in fragments, a classroom of eager young faces, their voices chiming in unison as they answered questions. The sound of laughter during after-school programs he'd organized to keep kids off the streets. The pride in his wife's eyes when he came home with another award for community service. But those days were gone. Everything had changed after Diana's illness. His wife had been the center of his world, a force of stability and love that made every challenge bearable. When she got sick, he fought with everything he had to keep her afloat, sold their car, took on extra shifts, and even borrowed money he knew he couldn't repay. In the end, it wasn't enough. She passed away, leaving a void so vast that Jerome felt like he'd been swallowed whole. The bills piled up, the creditors were relentless. And then came the foreclosure notice. One by one, everything that tethered him to the life he once knew slipped through his fingers. He tried to hold on, tried to rebuild, but the weight of his grief and the indifference of the world around him were too much. He found himself on the streets, carrying only the clothes on his back and the memories he couldn't leave behind. The harsh voice of reality snapped him back to the present. His stomach growled, the sound loud enough to startle him. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning when a kind woman at a diner slipped him a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in a napkin. He didn't blame her for not doing more. People only had so much to give. The world was harsh to everyone, though harsher to some than others. Jerome glanced up at the sky. The rain wasn't letting up, and he couldn't stay here much longer. The abandoned building provided some shelter, but the cold was seeping into his bones. He needed to find a place, any place, where he could stay dry for the night. Tightening his coat once more, he pushed himself to his feet. His knees protested with a dull ache, but he ignored it. Pain had become a familiar companion. As he shuffled down the street, the city seemed both alive and utterly dead. The lights of downtown flickered in the distance, promising warmth and life, but they were a world away from where Jerome walked. Here, on the edges of society, the buildings were crumbling, and the few people who wandered the streets did so with their heads down, shoulders hunched against the rain and the unspoken weight they carried. Jerome spotted the awning of a small corner store and made his way toward it. The light above the entrance flickered, casting shadows that danced along the wet pavement. The store was closed, but the overhang provided just enough protection to keep the rain off his head. He leaned against the wall, his breath fogging up in the cool night air. As he stood there, he thought about the few coins in his pocket. He'd managed to collect them throughout the day, some from the kindness of strangers, some from scavenging bottles and cans. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy a piece of bread if he could find an open store in the morning. The thought gave him a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by the sound of an approaching car. The low rumble of the engine grew louder, and soon a pair of headlights cut through the darkness. Jerome instinctively straightened up, his body tensing. He had learned to recognize the sound of trouble, and this car had trouble written all over it. The vehicle slowed as it approached, its tires hissing against the wet pavement. A police cruiser. Jerome's heart sank. His experiences with the police had rarely been pleasant. He tried to make himself small, invisible, hoping they would drive past. But the cruiser came to a stop a few feet away, and the driver's side door swung open. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out, his uniform pristine despite the rain. The officer's presence was commanding, his every movement deliberate. He adjusted his belt as he approached, his expression unreadable but undeniably intimidating. Jerome didn't move. He knew better than to make any sudden gestures or say anything that could be misconstrued. He simply stood there, the rain pooling at his feet, and waited for the inevitable confrontation. The officer stopped a few steps away, his eyes scanning Jerome from head to toe. Finally, he spoke, his tone sharp and accusatory. "What are you doing here?" Jerome hesitated, his mind racing to find the least incriminating answer. "Just trying to stay out of the rain," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the downpour. The officer didn't look convinced. He took a step closer, his hand resting on the hilt of his flashlight. "This isn't a shelter. You can't just loiter here." Jerome felt the familiar sting of humiliation, but forced himself to stay calm. "I'm not causing any trouble, officer. I'll move on soon." The officer snorted, shaking his head. "You people always say that. But we both know you're just looking for an opportunity. Maybe to break in, steal something. Am I right?" Jerome's jaw tightened, but he kept his gaze down. Arguing would only make things worse. He knew that all too well. The officer's flashlight clicked on, and the beam of light swept over Jerome's face, blinding him momentarily. The officer took another step forward, now close enough that Jerome could smell the faint scent of cologne mixed with rainwater. "Let me see your hands," the officer barked. Jerome raised his hands slowly, his palms facing forward. His movements were deliberate, cautious. The officer stared at him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as if searching for something, anything, that could justify escalating the situation further. Jerome stood frozen, the rain continuing to fall around them. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, its lonely howl cutting through the oppressive silence. The flashlight beam lingered on Jerome's hands, illuminating every wrinkle and callus that told the story of a hard life. He held his breath, resisting the urge to flinch under the officer's scrutiny. The man's presence was overwhelming, his posture rigid, his expression twisted into a mask of suspicion. The rain pelted down around them, soaking Jerome's coat and dripping from the brim of the officer's hat, but neither of them moved. "What's in your pockets?" the officer demanded, his tone sharper this time. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "Nothing much," Jerome replied, keeping his voice even. "Just some change." "Take it out, slowly." Jerome nodded and reached into his pocket with deliberate movements, fishing out a handful of coins. They jingled as he extended his hand, the raindrops glistening on the small pile of silver and copper. It wasn't much, barely enough for a loaf of bread, but to Jerome it represented hours of swallowing his pride and accepting the pity of strangers. The officer eyed the coins with disdain. "That's it?" he said, his voice thick with disbelief. "That's what you're carrying?" Jerome nodded. "It's all I've got." The officer let out a low chuckle, a sound that sent a shiver down Jerome's spine. "You expect me to believe that you've been standing out here in the middle of the night with just a pocket full of change? You're either lying or up to no good." "I'm just trying to stay dry," Jerome said, his voice cracking slightly. He hated how weak he sounded, but he was exhausted. Exhausted from the rain, the cold, and the constant weight of being treated as less than human. The officer ignored his explanation, stepping back and motioning with his flashlight. "Turn around," he ordered. Jerome hesitated. "Why?" "Don't ask questions, just do it." Swallowing the lump in his throat, Jerome turned slowly, his heart pounding. He could feel the officer's eyes on him, sizing him up, searching for something that wasn't there. The flashlight beam swept over his body, pausing at his coat, his pants, his shoes. Jerome clenched his fists, fighting the urge to protest. He knew from experience that resistance would only make things worse. The officer stepped closer again, now standing just behind him. "Put your hands against the wall," he said, his voice low and commanding. Jerome obeyed, pressing his palms against the cold, wet surface of the building. He stared at the bricks in front of him, their rough texture a stark contrast to the smooth surface of his memories, the polished floors of the classroom where he used to teach, the soft upholstery of the couch where he and Diana used to sit together. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. The officer's hands patted him down, rough and invasive. He searched every pocket, every fold of Jerome's clothing, finding nothing but the damp fabric that clung to his skin. When he finally stepped back, Jerome exhaled shakily, his breath visible in the cold night air. "Nothing," the officer muttered, almost to himself. Then, louder, "Turn around." Jerome turned slowly, his arms hanging limply at his sides. He met the officer's gaze for the first time, his dark eyes filled with a quiet defiance that he couldn't suppress. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain continued to fall, the silence between them broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional splash of water as it pooled on the pavement. "You're lucky," the officer said finally, his tone laced with condescension. "But don't think for a second that I believe your little story. You people are all the same, always looking for a way to take advantage." Jerome's fists clenched involuntarily. He wanted to shout, to argue, to demand that the man see him for who he really was. But he knew it would be useless. This man had already decided who Jerome was, and no amount of explanation or reasoning would change his mind. "I'm not looking for trouble," Jerome said quietly. "I just want to be left alone." The officer smirked, a cruel twist of his lips. "Left alone, huh? That's funny, because it seems like you're the kind of guy who finds trouble wherever he goes." He took a step closer, so close now that Jerome could smell the faint scent of cologne mixed with the rainwater dripping from his uniform. "Listen to me," the officer said, his voice low and dangerous. "If I catch you hanging around here again, I won't be so nice next time. Got it?" Jerome nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The officer stared at him for another moment, as if daring him to say something, then turned and walked back to his car. The door slammed shut and the engine roared to life. Jerome watched as the cruiser pulled away, its red and blue lights flashing briefly before disappearing into the darkness. For a long time, Jerome stood there, his body trembling, not from the cold, but from the anger and humiliation that coursed through him. He wanted to scream, to hit something, to make someone, anyone, understand what it felt like to be stripped of your dignity over and over again. But all he could do was stand there, his fists clenched, the rain soaking him to the bone. When he finally moved, it was with slow, deliberate steps. He walked away from the corner store, away from the scene of his latest humiliation, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. He couldn't shake the officer's words, the way they echoed in his head like a taunt. You people are all the same. As he walked, Jerome's gaze caught on something in the corner of the store's awning, a small, blinking red light. A security camera. His heart skipped a beat. The camera had seen everything. It was a slim hope, but it was something. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to prove that he wasn't the man the officer had tried to make him out to be. Jerome kept walking, the rain still falling around him. But now, for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was close. The next morning, Jerome woke to the faint warmth of sunlight breaking through the gray clouds. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, leaving the streets slick and shining under the pale light. He stretched his aching limbs, his body stiff from sleeping against the cold, hard wall of an alley. His stomach growled loudly, a reminder of how long it had been since he'd eaten anything substantial. The events of the previous night played over in his mind, each moment vivid and raw. The officer's voice dripping with disdain, the flashlight beam stripping him of any remaining dignity. The words that stung more than any blow could have. You people are all the same. Jerome shook his head, trying to push the memory aside. He couldn't afford to dwell on it. Survival didn't leave room for self-pity, but the blinking light of the security camera lingered in his thoughts. It was a lifeline, however tenuous. If he could get his hands on that footage, he'd have proof. Proof that he wasn't the aggressor. Proof that he'd been humiliated without cause. Proof that he mattered. With renewed determination, Jerome made his way back toward the corner store. His steps were slow and measured, partly because his body still ached from the night before, but also because he knew this wasn't going to be easy. He had no idea how to access the footage or if the store owner would even consider helping him. When he arrived, the store was open, its fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over the shelves of snacks, drinks, and everyday necessities. Jerome hesitated at the entrance, his reflection staring back at him in the glass door. He looked like what people expected a homeless man to look like, unshaven, with worn clothes and tired eyes. It wasn't an appearance that invited sympathy. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. A small bell chimed above the door, announcing his presence. Behind the counter stood an older man with a balding head and a pair of glasses perched on his nose. He looked up from a magazine and gave Jerome a once-over, his expression instantly guarded. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice flat. Jerome cleared his throat. "I was here last night," he began, "outside, under the awning. There was an incident. I think your camera might have caught it." The man's eyebrows knitted together in confusion, then suspicion. "An incident? What kind of incident?" "A police officer," Jerome said carefully, choosing his words with precision. "He stopped me, searched me, and—" He hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Things got out of hand. The store owner's expression hardened. He shook his head and turned back to his magazine. "I don't want any trouble." "I'm not here to cause trouble," Jerome said quickly. "I just need the footage. Please, it could prove what happened." The man let out a sigh, folding his magazine and setting it aside. "Listen," he said, leaning forward on the counter. "I don't know what happened out there, and I don't want to know, but I've been in this business long enough to know that getting involved in police matters is a bad idea." Jerome felt his heart sink. "I understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but this isn't just about me. That officer, he abuses his power. I'm sure I'm not the first person he's done this to, and I won't be the last. Please, I just need a copy of the footage." The store owner stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he shook his head again. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I can't help you." Jerome opened his mouth to protest, but the bell above the door chimed again, and another customer walked in. The store owner turned his attention to the newcomer, effectively ending the conversation. Jerome stood there for a moment, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He wanted to shout, to demand that the man understand what was at stake, but he knew it wouldn't make a difference. Defeated, he turned and left the store, the bell chiming once more as the door closed behind him. He stood on the sidewalk, his mind racing. If the store owner wouldn't help him, how else could he get the footage? Breaking in wasn't an option. He'd only confirm the officer's suspicions about him. He needed another way. As he walked aimlessly through the streets, a thought occurred to him. He needed help, someone who knew the system, who understood how to navigate it, someone who would believe him. His mind flashed to a face he'd seen before, on the pages of a discarded newspaper he'd read weeks ago. A journalist named Rachel Mills, known for her investigative work on police misconduct. Jerome didn't know much about her, but her articles had left an impression. She had exposed corruption in the city's police department, leading to the resignation of several high-ranking officers. If anyone could help him, it was her. Finding her wasn't going to be easy, though. Jerome had no phone, no access to the internet, and no address to start with. All he had was the name and a faint hope that she might be willing to listen. He decided to try his luck at the public library, hoping they'd let him use one of their computers to look her up. When he arrived, the librarian eyed him warily, but said nothing as he walked toward the rows of computers. Jerome sat down at one and stared at the screen, unsure where to begin. He typed "Rachel Mills Journalist" into the search bar and hit enter. A list of results appeared, including a profile on the city newspaper's website. He clicked on the link and scanned the page. It included her email address and the name of the newsroom where she worked. Jerome scribbled the information onto a scrap of paper and left the library, his next destination clear in his mind. The newsroom was downtown, far from the crumbling edges of the city where Jerome usually stayed. The streets grew cleaner and brighter as he approached, the buildings taller and more imposing. He felt out of place here, like an intruder in a world that wasn't meant for him. But he kept walking, his determination outweighing his discomfort. When he reached the building, he hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The lobby was sleek and modern, with polished floors and a receptionist sitting behind a large desk. Jerome approached her cautiously. "Excuse me," he said. "I'm looking for Rachel Mills." The receptionist glanced up, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in his appearance. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Jerome admitted, "but it's important. I need to speak with her." The woman frowned, clearly unimpressed. "Miss Mills is very busy. She doesn't take unscheduled meetings." "Please," Jerome said, "just tell her it's about police misconduct. She'll want to hear this." The receptionist hesitated, then picked up the phone and dialed a number. She spoke in hushed tones, glancing at Jerome occasionally before hanging up. "Take a seat," she said. "I'll see if she's available." Jerome nodded and sat down, his hands gripping his knees as he waited. Minutes felt like hours, but finally a woman appeared from the hallway. She was younger than he'd expected, with sharp features and an air of confidence that was both intimidating and reassuring. "I'm Rachel Mills," she said, her tone brisk. "What's this about?" Jerome stood, his heart pounding. "It's a long story," he said, "but I think you'll want to hear it." Rachel Mills led Jerome into a small, glass-walled meeting room tucked in the corner of the bustling newsroom. The faint hum of ringing phones, hurried footsteps, and muffled conversations filled the space around them. She gestured for him to sit and took a seat across from him, pulling out a small notebook and pen. Her sharp eyes scanned him quickly, taking in his weathered coat, worn hands, and tired face. "You've got 10 minutes, she said briskly. "Make it count." Jerome nodded, clasping his hands in front of him to steady them. He hesitated, unsure where to start, but Rachel's expectant expression forced him to begin. He recounted the events of the previous night: the rain, the officer's arrival, the humiliating search, and the rough treatment he endured. He described the store's security camera and his failed attempt to convince the owner to release the footage. Rachel's expression didn't change as he spoke, but her pen moved rapidly across the page, jotting down notes. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, tapping the pen against her lip thoughtfully. "You're saying the officer assaulted you without provocation," she said, her tone carefully neutral, "and there's potential video evidence to back up your claim." "Yes," Jerome said, "that camera saw everything." "Do you have any proof beyond the camera?" she asked. "Any witnesses, injuries, anything else that can corroborate your story?" Jerome hesitated. "I have bruises," he said finally, lifting his sleeve to reveal the dark marks on his arm. "But no witnesses, just me and that camera." Rachel nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "Let's talk about the officer. What's his name?" "Brian Hall," Jerome replied, the name tasting bitter in his mouth. He didn't say it, but it was on his badge. Rachel's pen stopped moving. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time her professional demeanor cracked. "Brian Hall," she repeated. "You're sure?" Jerome nodded. "You've heard of him?" "More than I'd like to," Rachel said. "He's been on my radar for a while. There have been whispers, complaints of excessive force, intimidation tactics, abuse of authority, but nothing concrete. No one's been willing to come forward." "Well, I'm coming forward," Jerome said firmly. "I can't let him keep doing this." Rachel studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she closed her notebook and stood. "Wait here," she said. "I need to make a call." She left the room, leaving Jerome alone with his thoughts. His nerves were on edge, his mind racing with doubts and fears. Was he doing the right thing? Would Rachel help him, or would she dismiss him like so many others had? He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. He'd come too far to back down now. After what felt like an eternity, Rachel returned, holding her phone in one hand and a steaming cup of coffee in the other. She sat down and placed the phone on the table, leaning forward slightly. "I spoke with a contact of mine," she said. "Someone who's been keeping tabs on Hall. They think this might be the break we've been waiting for." Jerome felt a flicker of hope. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm in," Rachel said. "I'll help you, but we need to move carefully. Hall has friends in the department, people who'll cover for him if they get wind of this. We can't give them the chance." Jerome nodded, relief washing over him. For the first time in years, someone believed him. Someone was willing to stand with him. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. "What do we do next?" he asked. "First, we need that footage," Rachel said. "If the store owner won't hand it over willingly, we'll have to put some pressure on him. I have a few ideas." Rachel and Jerome returned to the corner store that afternoon. The rain had stopped, but the air was still damp and heavy, and Jerome felt a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach as they approached the building. He glanced at Rachel, who walked beside him with purposeful strides, her confidence unwavering. Inside, the store owner looked up from the counter and frowned. "You again?" he said, his tone laced with irritation. His gaze shifted to Rachel, and his frown deepened. "Who's this?" "This is Rachel Mills," Jerome said. "She's a journalist." The man's eyes narrowed. "I told you, I don't want any trouble." "We're not here to cause trouble," Rachel said smoothly, stepping forward. "We just want the footage from your security camera, that's all." "I already told him no," the man said, "and my answer hasn't changed." Rachel reached into her bag and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the counter. "I understand your concerns," she said, "but let me explain the situation. Officer Hall has a history of misconduct. We believe that footage could expose a pattern of abuse and hold him accountable. If you help us, you'll be doing a public service." The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Rachel and Jerome. "And if I don't?" Rachel smiled faintly. "Then you'll be protecting a corrupt officer who's hurting people. And if this story breaks, and it will, we'll have to mention that you refused to cooperate. People might wonder why." The man's jaw tightened. "Are you threatening me?" "Not at all," Rachel said. "I'm just explaining the stakes. This is your chance to do the right thing." The room was silent for a long moment. Finally, the man sighed and rubbed his temples. "Fine," he said. "I'll give you the footage. But if this comes back to bite me—" "It won't," Rachel promised. "We'll make sure of it." The man disappeared into a back room, returning a few minutes later with a USB drive. He handed it to Rachel without a word, his expression sour. She thanked him and tucked the drive into her bag before turning to leave. Outside, Jerome let out a shaky breath. "I can't believe that worked." Rachel grinned. "People like him just need a little push. Now, let's see what we've got." Back at the newsroom, Rachel plugged the drive into her laptop, and the two of them watched the footage together. Jerome's heart pounded as he saw himself on the screen, huddled under the awning as the police cruiser pulled up. The confrontation played out in stark detail. Hall's aggressive search, his demeaning words, the moment he shoved Jerome against the wall. When the video ended, Rachel leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. "This is it," she said. "This is the evidence we need." Jerome nodded, his throat tight. For the first time, he felt like he had a chance, like justice was within reach. But he knew this was only the beginning. The fight ahead would be long and difficult, and there was no guarantee of victory. Still, he was ready. For the first time in years, he was ready. Rachel's newsroom was abuzz with activity. Phones rang incessantly, keyboards clicked in a relentless rhythm, and reporters moved between desks chasing stories. But in the small corner office where Rachel worked, the world seemed to narrow down to the video playing on her laptop screen. The grainy footage of Jerome's encounter with Officer Hall looped for the third time, its stark reality undeniable. Rachel paused the video, her finger hovering over the trackpad. "This is strong," she said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "The aggression, the unnecessary search, the physical force, it's all here. But we need to frame this right. We can't just drop this video online and hope for the best." Jerome sat across from her, his hands resting on his lap. The bruises on his arms were still tender, a painful reminder of the encounter. "What do you mean?" he asked. "This video tells part of the story," Rachel explained. "But we need to show people who you are, Jerome. You're not just a victim. You're a person with a history, a life, a reason for people to care." Jerome nodded slowly, her words settling over him like a weight. "What do I need to do?" Rachel leaned forward, her elbows resting on her desk. "You tell your story. Everything. Not just what happened that night, but who you were before, how you ended up here, and why this fight matters. The public needs to see the whole picture." The idea of baring his soul to strangers made Jerome uneasy, but he understood the importance. His voice had been silenced for too long. If this was the way to be heard, then so be it. They spent hours piecing together his story. Rachel asked questions, her pen scribbling across her notepad as Jerome spoke. He recounted his childhood in a close-knit community, his years as a teacher, the joy he'd found in mentoring young students. He described Diana, his late wife, with a tenderness that brought tears to his eyes and the pain of losing her that had unraveled his carefully built life. By the time they finished, the office was quiet, most of the staff having gone home for the night. Rachel looked at her notes, her expression thoughtful. "This isn't just a story about police misconduct," she said. "It's a story about resilience, about how systems fail people, and about the power of standing up for yourself. This will resonate." The next step was crafting the article and preparing the video for publication. Rachel worked late into the night, typing furiously while Jerome sat nearby, alternately watching her and staring out the window. His nerves buzzed with anticipation and fear. Once the story was out, there would be no turning back. The article went live the following morning. Rachel had titled it, "A Voice Against the System, Jerome Carter's Fight for Justice." It detailed Jerome's life before and after his fall from stability, the systemic issues that contributed to his plight, and the events leading to his confrontation with Officer Hall. The video accompanied the article, unedited and raw, allowing viewers to see the truth for themselves. The reaction was immediate. Within hours, the article began to circulate online, shared across social media platforms and news sites. Comments flooded in, some expressing outrage at Hall's behavior, others sharing similar experiences of police misconduct. A few were less sympathetic, dismissing Jerome as just another vagrant. But the overwhelming response was supportive. Rachel's phone rang constantly, reporters from other outlets calling for quotes or interviews. She coordinated with legal advocates and activists, ensuring the story gained traction in the right circles. Jerome watched it all unfold with a mixture of awe and trepidation. The quiet life he'd lived for years, invisible and ignored, had been shattered in an instant. By the afternoon, protests had begun to form outside the police precinct where Hall worked. Small at first, they quickly grew as more people learned about the case. Placards with slogans like "Justice for Jerome" and "Stop Police Abuse" dotted the crowd, their chants echoing through the streets. Jerome had never imagined his story would inspire such a response, but with the attention came risks. Rachel warned him to stay vigilant. Hall's allies in the police department wouldn't take this lying down, and there was no telling what they might do to protect one of their own. Jerome agreed to stay at a shelter connected to an activist group, away from the streets where he was most vulnerable. That evening, Rachel received an email from the police department. It was a brief, carefully worded statement announcing that Officer Hall had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jerome read the statement over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. "They're just trying to buy time," he said, "hoping this will all blow over." "Maybe," Rachel said, "but it won't. Not if we keep the pressure on." The following day, Jerome was invited to speak at a rally organized by local activists. The idea terrified him. He'd spent so long blending into the background, avoiding attention, that the thought of standing in front of a crowd was almost too much to bear. But Rachel insisted it was necessary. "You're the face of this movement now," she told him. "People need to hear from you." The rally was held in a park near City Hall, the crowd stretching far beyond what Jerome had expected. He stood on the makeshift stage, his hands trembling as he gripped the microphone. Rachel stood nearby, nodding encouragingly. When he finally spoke, his voice was shaky at first, but it grew steadier with each word. He told the crowd about his life, his work as a teacher, his love for Diana, and the struggles that had brought him to this point. He spoke about the encounter with Hall, the humiliation and fear he'd felt, and the importance of standing up against injustice. "I'm not here because I want pity," he said, his voice ringing out across the park. "I'm here because I want change. No one should have to go through what I did. No one should have to feel invisible, powerless, or less than human. We all deserve dignity. We all deserve justice." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers washing over him like a wave. For the first time in years, Jerome felt seen, not as a problem to be dismissed, but as a person who mattered. As the rally ended, Rachel approached him, a proud smile on her face. "You did good," she said, "really good." Jerome nodded, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and relief. But he knew the fight was far from over. Hall and his allies wouldn't go down without a fight, and the system that had failed him so many times before wasn't going to change overnight. Still, for the first time in years, Jerome felt hope, not just for himself, but for the possibility of a better future. And he was ready to keep fighting. The days following the rally were a whirlwind. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying Jerome's voice far beyond the boundaries of the city. Major networks reached out for interviews. Social media platforms buzzed with hashtags like #JusticeForJerome, and activists around the country began using his case to highlight broader issues of systemic abuse and racial injustice. Officer Hall's suspension was officially confirmed in a press conference by the city's police chief. Standing behind a podium, the chief attempted to strike a neutral tone, emphasizing the importance of due process while acknowledging the public outcry. "This department takes all allegations of misconduct seriously," he said, his voice firm but measured. "We are committed to conducting a thorough investigation into the actions of Officer Hall." The words rang hollow to Jerome. He had seen this playbook before. Officials making vague promises, hoping the outrage would subside with time. But this time felt different. This time, the people were paying attention and the pressure wasn't letting up. Rachel continued working tirelessly, coordinating with legal advocates and pushing for accountability at every level. She helped Jerome connect with a lawyer from a civil rights organization who filed a formal complaint against Hall and the department. The footage from the corner store camera became the cornerstone of their case, its clarity leaving little room for denial. But as momentum grew, so did the backlash. Jerome began receiving anonymous threats, hostile messages scrawled on scraps of paper left outside the shelter, his name and face vilified in certain corners of the internet. Rachel received similar treatment, her inbox flooded with hateful emails accusing her of anti-police propaganda. The fear was real, but it only solidified their resolve. Then came the legal proceedings. Hall's attorney, a sharp-tongued man with years of experience defending officers accused of misconduct, argued that the footage was taken out of context. He painted a picture of Jerome as a volatile individual with a history of instability, attempting to frame Hall's actions as justified under the circumstances. Jerome sat in the courtroom, listening to the defense twist the narrative into something unrecognizable. His lawyer countered with the facts: the unprovoked aggression, the unnecessary search, the physical violence. Witness testimony from Rachel, the store owner, and even a former colleague of Hall's, who anonymously submitted a statement about his pattern of abusive behavior, bolstered Jerome's case. The turning point came when Jerome himself took the stand. Dressed in a borrowed suit and tie, he faced the courtroom with a quiet dignity that silenced even the harshest skeptics. He told his story with unwavering honesty, his voice steady as he recounted the events of that night and the struggles that had led him there. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "It's about every person who's been dismissed, dehumanized, and treated as though their life doesn't matter. We can't fix what's broken if we keep pretending it doesn't exist." The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Jerome gripped the edge of the table, his heart pounding as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. "Guilty," the foreman said, the word hanging in the air like a bell ringing through the stillness. A wave of relief swept over Jerome, his shoulders sagging under the weight of emotions he'd held back for so long. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, reporters rushing to capture the moment, but all Jerome could do was close his eyes and breathe. Justice had been served, at least in part. Officer Hall was stripped of his badge and sentenced to a year of probation, along with mandatory community service and enrollment in de-escalation training. It wasn't the harshest punishment, but it was a precedent. A message that even those in positions of power were not above accountability. The fallout extended beyond Hall. The police department faced a wave of scrutiny, with activists demanding broader reforms. Internal investigations uncovered other instances of misconduct, leading to the dismissal of several officers and the implementation of new oversight measures. It was far from perfect, but it was a start. For Jerome, the resolution brought a mix of emotions. He was grateful for the support he'd received, for the people who had rallied around him and amplified his voice. But the scars, both physical and emotional, remained. The fight had taken its toll, and he knew the journey wasn't over. Rachel visited him at the shelter the day after the verdict. She brought coffee and pastries, a rare treat, and they sat together in the quiet common room. "You did it," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You stood up to the system and won." Jerome shook his head. "We did it," he corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Rachel shrugged, brushing off the praise. "You're the one who lived it, Jerome. I just helped tell the story." He nodded, letting her words sink in. For so long he'd felt invisible, like a shadow moving through the world unnoticed. Now people saw him, They listened, and while it didn't erase the pain of the past, it gave him something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. As they sipped their coffee, Rachel leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "What's next for you?" she asked. Jerome considered the question, the answer coming to him slowly but with certainty. "I want to help others," he said. "People like me. People who've been pushed aside, ignored, and forgotten. I want to make sure they're seen." Rachel smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "You're going to be good at that," she said. Jerome smiled back, a faint but genuine expression of hope. The storm that had consumed his life was beginning to clear, and for the first time in years he could see a path forward. The sun rose over the city, painting the skyline in hues of amber and gold. Jerome stood at the window of the small community center where he now worked, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. The world outside bustled with life. Cars honking, people chatting as they hurried down the sidewalks, but within the quiet walls of the center, Jerome found a sense of calm he hadn't known in years. The room behind him was modest but inviting, filled with mismatched furniture donated by locals. The shelves were lined with books and pamphlets about housing rights, employment resources, and community support programs. A bulletin board near the door displayed flyers for upcoming workshops, including one Jerome himself was set to lead: Reclaiming Your Voice, Advocating for Yourself in a Broken System. It had been 6 months since the trial, 6 months since he had stood in court and told the world his story. The experience had been harrowing, but it had also been transformative. The support he'd received had been overwhelming, not just from activists and advocates, but from everyday people who had seen themselves in his struggle. His victory in the courtroom was just the beginning. The civil rights organization that had represented him had offered him a position as a peer advocate, working directly with those facing homelessness and systemic discrimination. Jerome had hesitated at first, unsure if he was ready to take on such a role, but Rachel had encouraged him. "You have a perspective most people don't," she'd said. "You've lived it. That makes you invaluable." Now, standing in the warm light of the morning, Jerome couldn't imagine doing anything else. Every day, he met people who were fighting battles like his own, people who had been silenced, dismissed, and made to feel invisible. He listened to their stories, offered them resources, and helped them navigate a system that often seemed designed to keep them down. The center's door creaked open, pulling Jerome from his thoughts. A young man in his early 20s stepped inside, his thin frame wrapped in a threadbare jacket. His eyes darted nervously around the room, as though expecting to be turned away. "Can I help you?" Jerome asked, setting his mug on the windowsill. The man hesitated, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I heard you help people," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jerome smiled gently. "We do. Come in, let's talk." He guided the man to one of the worn couches and sat with him, listening as he explained his situation: a recent eviction, a lack of family support, and an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. The story was all too familiar, but Jerome didn't let it deter him. Instead, he offered the man a list of resources and made a call to a local shelter that had an available bed. As the man left with a newfound sense of hope, Jerome felt a quiet satisfaction settle over him. He couldn't fix everything, but he could make a difference, one person at a time. Later that afternoon, Rachel arrived at the center, her ever-present notebook tucked under one arm. She grinned when she saw Jerome, her eyes sparkling with the same energy that had first drawn him to trust her. "How's the new job treating you?" she asked, dropping into a chair near his desk. Jerome chuckled. Busy, but good. It feels right. Rachel nodded, pulling out her notebook. I've been meaning to ask, would you consider speaking at an event we're hosting next month? It's a panel on systemic reform, and I think your perspective would be invaluable. Jerome hesitated. Public speaking still wasn't his favorite thing, but he knew how important it was to keep the conversation alive. I'll do it, he said. If it helps people, I'm in. Rachel smiled, scribbling a note in her book. That's what I like to hear. As the day wound down, Jerome sat at his desk, reflecting on how far he'd come. The man he'd been a year ago felt like a distant memory, lost, invisible, and afraid. Now, he was part of something bigger than himself, a movement that was slowly but surely chipping away at the injustices he had once thought immovable. The world wasn't perfect. The system was still broken in many ways, and there were days when the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm him. But Jerome had learned to find strength in the small victories, in the smiles of the people he helped, in the progress being made, and in the knowledge that his voice, once silenced, now carried weight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jerome locked up the center and stepped outside. The cool evening air wrapped around him, but it no longer felt oppressive. He had found his place in the world again, and with it, a sense of purpose that no one could take away. The fight wasn't over, but Jerome was ready for whatever came next. With every step forward, he carried not just his own story, but the stories of countless others, proof that even in the face of injustice, resilience and hope could prevail. If this story has touched you, support our channel. Subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. Share this video so that others can also recognize this story. Don't forget to check out our other stories. There are many more interesting ones.